Cool. So, what I wanted to discuss with you guys today is primarily a little bit more of um, material characteristics and how you can view them. I'm not saying how you should view them, but primarily how you can view them. Um, which I cover the principles themselves extensively in the first classroom on material characteristics, and now I want to just go over them in like a recap and look at a specific example, and then just look at jello in this instance. But the thing that you should take away from this classroom is how you can regard any material in this manner. So that means that the materials that I posted in the reference library this week, which is gray rock, jello, porcelain. There's wood, and I posted one more in there. Oh, candles, right? So more like wax. Um, it's a good training exercise for you to figure out how you can view the principles that I'm about to discuss right now, how you can apply that to your studies, and how to make your life actually easier when you actually understand these principles. So, getting into it, there's five principles that you should already know about, having looked at the previous classroom. If you haven't, I'm failing you. Nonetheless, there are five characteristics. There are probably more, but there are five that um, have really helped me, and I've derived them from 3D programs because 3D software kind of treats material characteristics the same way. So there's five things that you should consider, which is local value, as you can see on the top left, texture, reflectivity, specularity, and diffusion. Now it's important to know that the top two are going to influence the bottom three, right? So it depends on the local value and the texture of your material. That's going to indicate what kind of features and characteristics your material is going to display. So it's either going to be reflective, specular, diffused, and local value and texture is going to have an effect on that. So going over them one by one. Local value is easy, of course. It's just the value of the material itself. Whether that's the inherent value or the painted value or whatever, the artificially added value, doesn't matter. At least it has a value, right? If it's deep red, like jello, for instance, which is a good example in this case, it's actually a very low value, right? It's a pretty dark color because it's deep red. So that is going to affect your reflectivity, specularity, and diffusion. There's higher values like porcelain, which is super bright, right? It's very white. So it is inherently going to have a very different characteristic because of that. Now, texture is one of the main factors, and it's the one that a lot of beginners don't take into consideration too often when they think about material characteristics. Now, the thing is, and I talk about this in the classroom session, the first one, is that texture is going to have a high influence on the way that light acts onto your object. So if texture, for instance, the surface area of your object is very clear, right? Then light will have a very easy time just bouncing off of it. Now it's not going to bounce off in one corner, it's going to scatter around. But it's bouncing off, or the strength of the bounce back. So let me just do that in a different color. The strength of the bounce back is going to be lower, but it's still going to be very close to the original light ray in terms of luminar strength. Whereas if you have something that has just a little bit more texture, right? When light hits it, there is going to be a little bit of what they call diffusion, right? Because the light rays are going to be hitting all those cavities, going to get scattered around, and we're going to have some diffusion. Now, there can be a lot of surface texture, right? Which is going to highly diffuse the light, right? So texture is going to have a high impact on specularity and diffusion. If you look at reflectivity, again, this also has to do with the surface texture. So the smoother an object is, and also dependent on its local value, it is going to have high reflectivity. The thing is, though, and we'll look at this especially in the jello instance, or I'm going to leave that for later. But so reflectivity just basically means the ability to reflect the environment, right? Think of a chrome ball, steel, mirror, things like that. High reflectivity. Specularity isn't the same as reflectivity, and this is why, if you know how to separate these two, because that's going to be important in the jello example, is specularity is the ability to reflect the intensity of the light source. So let me repeat that. Specularity is the ability to reflect the intensity of the light source. Meaning, if you think of a billiard ball and we have a light source coming from this direction, right? That billiard ball is going to be able to reflect that light source, and we're even almost going to be able to see that light source one-to-one, and it's going to be able to reflect the strength of that light source directly into our eyes. Whereas if we have something like a rubber ball or a basketball or a wooden ball, these have high texture, right? Their surface texture is higher, so the light is going to get relatively diffused, meaning that the specularity aspect drops down significantly. So the ability for that rubber ball to reflect the intensity of the light source is going to diminish greatly. So that's why we're not going to see as much of the light source, and thus we're not going to see as much of a highlight or any highlight at all. Right, so that's why these characteristics kind of give us more of a practical approach on dealing with materials. So again, reflectivity is the ability to reflect the environment. Specularity is the ability to reflect the intensity of the light source. And diffusion is the amount of light that gets diffused depending on the texture, usually, of the object. So a higher diffusion amount usually means higher texture, or the inherent material has some sort of a local value, right? For instance, black versus white. If you have a very dark, very black, deep blue ball, that in itself, the color itself, is going to absorb more of the light. So it's going to diffuse more of that light as well. Does that make sense so far? Does anyone have any questions on these characteristics? Local value is actually the color under no light pad. Of course, or ambient light for that matter. But ambient light can still have some sort of color. So let's call it a very neutral ambient light. It's the most true form of the color without being, without being affected by any light source. Just gonna take a sip of water. Yeah, you could regard diffusion as a sort of specularity. I'm sorry, my voice keeps breaking up when I talk for too long. I've been filled with meetings today. So yeah, diffusion is usually the breaking up of light. Like I showed you here, when light hits the surface that has high texture, it's going to break up that light source. Meaning, if it breaks up, the more it breaks up due to the cavities that you have or the bumps and indents on the surface texture, the more it breaks up, the less powerful that light source that's being bounced back is going to be. Whereas if you have a very smooth surface, it's going to bounce back almost one-to-one. Not completely one-to-one, but almost. So that's what diffusion actually is. The more it kind of literally diffuses the light or breaks up those light rays and makes them less powerful, that's when you create diffusion. Now, when we, or when you, when you guys analyze your textures or materials, when you analyze your materials, whether that's wood, porcelain, jello, you kind of need to think of it, and you don't need to literally do this, but it's just a nice visual diagram. It's like, okay, where on this diagram does my material sit? And so for something like porcelain, it could be very high, right? And let's just do porcelain for a second, just to drive home. I'm going to indicate that in blue. So let's say we have porcelain, right? Porcelain is going to have a higher local value. It's going to have very little texture, like almost none, right? It's going to be high in specularity. It's going to be low in diffusion, and it's going to be relatively high in reflectivity, right? So the graphic for porcelain might look more like this. And so that's something that you can consider, and it's especially useful primarily because if you're painting anything, right, you can think about these characteristics, and it should make your life easier because you can consider like what light sources are coming in, how these light sources are going to affect the material that you're lighting, how high your specularity can be, right, where you can put your highlights, how much reflectivity you can show. For instance, let's say we have a knight armor standing in the desert, right? Very brownish environment, sand. We know that steel, let's say it's a shiny armor, right? It's untouched, so it's relatively new armor. That means it's low in texture, right? If it's low in texture, it's going to be low in diffusion, meaning that it's going to have some form of reflectivity due to the nature of steel or plating. So that means that we know that we can put quite an amount of brown colors into the armor, especially at the bottom, because it's going to reflect its environment, right? So not only bounce light is going to affect it, but also just the environment, the reflectivity of that material is going to affect its color itself. And so it's things like this that can help you with figuring out how to paint something. And so if we look at jello, which is kind of an exception, as are all translucent materials, is jello has a pretty dark local value, right? It's low in texture if it's molded perfectly, but it can be higher in texture depending on, because it's full of air bubbles, and if you cut it wrong, or so it can have a higher dense, or with a bad mold, it could have a higher surface texture. So its diffusion can relatively vary, and that you also see this in real life examples. Reflectivity is going to be none, and this is going to be a pop quiz for you guys. Diffusion is somewhat there because of that difference in texture, and it's going to have high specularity. The reason it usually has high specularity because on the places where it is, let's say, molded perfectly, it has a very, very smooth surface area, so the light is going to reflect relatively well. So it's going to be high in specularity. Now it's going to be low in reflectivity, even though if it has a very smooth surface, it's still going to be low in reflectivity. Now, do you guys know why? Or can you guess why? Yeah, exactly. Goose got it right first. So what coins for Goose? Yes, because of the translucent nature of jello or other materials that have translucency. Basically, there's three types of principles or material characteristics that interact with light. There's opaque, that doesn't let any light through. There's translucent that lets a little bit of light through, and there's transparent, right, which basically lets all the light through. Now, because of the translucent nature of jello, instead of the light rays bouncing back to us on every surface, right, basically being able to reflect the ambient light, it's not able to, and it's just absorbing the light sources, especially if they're weaker light sources. And so stronger light sources do get a little bit of reflection, but more of them get absorbed, and they shine through the object, basically giving it that quintessential jello gummy look. The light rays are still reflecting back to us, but they're reflecting back to us from inside of the material. That's why it has such a high saturation, because the light rays that are getting bounced back into our eyes are coming back from that material. So even if we have like a yellow light, the yellow light interacts with the red material, and then it bounces back into our eyes, giving it a very saturated red look, as you can see here on the left of this cube. But as you can see with jello, so what it has is it has a couple of things that you should take into consideration, and this is how I look at materials when I study them. Is, let's take a green color. So we have light coming in from this side, and because of its high specularity, those light sources are gonna get reflected, or the light beams are gonna get reflected, and they're gonna show us almost one-to-one on certain areas the intensity of the light source. Primarily the surface that is aimed at directly or facing directly towards the light source is going to reflect that intensity almost one-to-one. Other ones that are still facing the light source but are not completely facing it are going to have a weaker specularity, but they're still going to have specularity. Then a lot of those light rays travel through, right? They're getting caught by that material, and then they're reflecting back into our eye. And then things happen that I told you earlier. They get caught by that red material, get reflected back to us, and give us that saturated look. Because of the high specularity, and I haven't mentioned this yet, because of the high specular nature of jello or something like metal or something like porcelain, the material is also going to be able to reflect back the ambient light, because as you know, as I hope at least you know, if you watched some of my shadowing tutorials on the fundamental website, fundamental section, we always have ambient light present, primarily because our key light is creating that ambient light. So depending on what kind of ambient environment we're in, the ambient light source is going to change. Now, if we're outside, at all times we have the blue skylight, right? So that's the ambient light. Because of the reflective or specular nature of jello, it's also going to be able to pick up on the ambient light. So it's basically going to reflect back a lot of that ambient light, and that's what we pick up on, and that's what we see. The most notable thing, I think, primarily with, if you want to make a thing look translucent, or in this case, jello-ish, is that a lot of the translucent lighting is going to happen on the shadow side. The reason it is happening on the shadow side is because otherwise the intensity of the light source itself, so the planes that are facing the light source, are going to be those light rays are going to be much stronger than the translucent light rays. So what I mean by that is that this is actually the shadow side of this cube, but because we have light shining through on it, so like really you're entering here, right, so to speak, into this material, and then it's bouncing back to us, but it's bouncing back to us through the shadow side because that's the easiest one for us to receive, because there's there is light there, but the light that is there is ambient light, and it's not as powerful as that translucent light shining through. Whereas the translucent the light that is bouncing back from our top surface, right, is super powerful. So the translucent light rays that try to come through here, we're not seeing them because they're not powerful enough. So far, does that make sense? All right. Cool. So, last pop question to think about, which is going to make your life easier. And the people that have done my mentorship cannot answer this question because I've told them already. Why? So knowing this, right? Knowing the things that I've told you right now, why does a material like a box, or when you look at a knife or a sword, why do the edges always have higher reflective or specularity than the rest of the material? So the edges on a cube, the edge here, you know, usually, or on a sword, why do they have higher specularity? All right, and explain the Fresnel effect, Alex. There's some truth to that, but even in a shadow side or a plane that's not directly facing the light, if you have corners in those planes, they are still going to have higher specularity. So why do you think that is? Boom, Jasmine got it right. Yes, there's less surface to diffuse. Well, there's less texture. Because a corner, if you look at it, a corner is a very sharp edge. So it's very hard for texture to appear on a corner. So it's going to have higher specularity. That's usually the case. All right. So that's it for the lecture. Now, if you look at my Jello Knight, I'm going to do another one after this. I'm just going to go over this one. So I made this one pretty quickly, just applying the principles that I know. Of course, I did a line art first, just as an underdrawing. But then I filled it with the local color, started simply shading, shadow mapping the things I really know are going to be in shadow. And then I add the translucency and the specularity first. And because I've studied the cube and I've analyzed how Jello kind of sits within these principles, I can confidently use the right color intensity value on these objects, of course knowing how to light my simple shapes, giving me the confidence to do that. I can then add more shadow sides and, you know, light sides, also adding a little bit of that texture onto the night, just to give it more of that kind of Jello feeling, and then finishing it off with some highlights. Now, the thing and this is going to be different for each of the materials that you guys are trying to represent in day 3, in like the object that has nothing to do with it. The thing that you'll need to do to give it believability or more believability is actually think about how it's manufactured. So what I mean by that is, like, this Jello Knight, I could have just painted a knight and kind of used the colors and the material characteristics of Jello and probably would have come up with a similar result. But because you also have to think about how Jello is actually manufactured most of the time, if you think of Jello figurines or whatever, they need to be molded. Meaning that a lot of the things that are separate with armor, now you kind of have to literally mold together as if they come out of a mold. So for instance, the arm I kind of attached directly to the body. things like the armor, they're all attached together as if like they're part of one big whole. Now you can make it a little bit more detailed as it would normally be, but things like that kind of give it that higher fidelity because you're treating it as something that's being manufactured. Now, this is a little thing that you should only worry about if you actually get to the full rendering. The thing you also see with Jello is, again, those corners that we just talked about, is the corners, the creases, are going to catch a little bit more of that specularity because they have less surface texture, right? So these are the things that I also think about when I'm shading and rendering a object like this. All right, and so I quickly sketched 2 new guys before the session. And I'm just gonna start painting this. Now I'm not sure how long this is gonna take. It could take a lot longer than anticipated, but for any of you who have the patience to sit through it, I'm willing to go as far as I can within the time limit. In the meantime, if you have any questions, ask them. Feel free to turn off your mute, have a chat. I don't want to be talking all the way through this myself. Rob, feel free to moderate. But yeah, if you have any questions, let me know. Oh, for fuck's sake. Thank you, Rob. You're out of here. It's the Jello brush. It is the Jello brush. No questions, wow. Either I'm ridiculously good at explaining things, or you guys just didn't listen to anything. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, right now I'm just using a very simple round brush, without flow. There is opacity on it if I wanted to, but I'm not really using it. I'm just using a normal layer as well because I want to. That's the thing with studying, or trying to apply a certain render quality. Just try to be confident in what you're drawing and not rely on too many layers. In this case, just for studying purposes. If you're doing anything from an illustration and you need to, just to make it more efficient, use whatever layer you want to. But for studying purposes, I find it best to just take it old school. highly depends on what you want to design, right? Right. It's hard if you're trying to stay true to the era, because then you really almost have to copy it one to one. You cannot be really free with it, because otherwise you're going to deviate from its original thing. Of course, it depends on what you're trying to replicate. If you're trying to do a building, you almost need to be authentic to it. If you're doing a character design that needs to represent some type of Art Nouveau or Baroque or whatever, then you're pretty much or a lot freer in what you use and what shapes you use. But then again, I always feel like it's easier to just pick one shape and see how far you can stretch that instead of using all the shapes you find in that style. If that makes sense. Is it usually the red shirt that dies first? Yeah, it's gonna be a completely new IP. Gonna have to sell this. Jello Knights IP, you betcha. Yep. It'd be like the new Toy Story. That's true. So the hardest thing when it comes to representing a material, especially when you're gonna light it on a made up object, is that you're gonna have to be relatively confident in lighting simple shapes because you're gonna have to, especially with this jello for instance, right, you're gonna have to invent your light source. And not only that, you have to be confident in the shapes that you put down. You have to design your shapes, and they have to, one, represent the material, and two, also just represent the volume, which is easier said than done. right, now that we got some of our shadow indication, we can think about the characteristics I just discussed. Let me just quickly get this going. So we can think about the characteristics that I just discussed, and because of its translucent nature, we have the lighting in this orientation coming in from the left. So it's going to pass through my night. It's going to illuminate the shadow side, because that's the side that's going to be able to reflect back to us. Right, it's going to be a relatively high in saturation. In this case, probably not, because of the distance. Now, the thing that you do see that I haven't mentioned in the classroom is that you are going to see some of the structure of your jello. So usually the way that it's molded, or where there are creases or folds or edges. For instance, on the cube example, the lower edge that's hitting the floor on the other side, the side that we don't see, you're going to see some of that shine through in the form of more of a shadowy color. So you're going to have a little bit of that transparency, which is going to help sell the translucent nature of the jello, right? So because of those crease lines and the way that it's molded. So for instance, and it's also a good way to think about your structure. For instance, this helmet, right? It's basically an ellipse, so it goes through like this. So I can have a bit of that light maybe shining onto that edge. Right? Like the light is picking up that edge and then reflecting back to us. And it's little things like that that can help you give it a little bit more believability. No, I just saturated it more and upped the value. For the shadows, I might make it a little bit more cooler, but not that much, because of what I've at least observed from jello is that it basically exists within the same hue a lot of the times, except for the reflection of the light and the ambient light. Jello, 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 jello. The recording is a lot more blown out than I want to have on my screen, but I'll share the final image with you guys. Yes, ask all the questions. So again, for believability's sake, I'm treating this armor, quote unquote, as if it's just molded to the body, because you wouldn't be able to mold it separately in the case of jello. So that adds just a little bit to the believability of it. And then on this side, on the shadow side, sorry, I told you about the specularity of the characteristics of jello. So it's also going to be able to reflect some of the specularity of the ambient light. So on this side, on the shadow side, we could have some of that ambient light, a little bit cooler, right, than our main light source. This is going to be here as well, shining through. It's not going to be, it's going to be very subtle, of course, because it's ambient light. It doesn't have a lot of potency, and especially when it's bounced back to us, it's going to be very dim, but it is going to be noticeable. See you later, Jazz. Glowing lines, Alex? Oh, you mean these ones? Yeah, so what you see oftentimes in jello is that you'll see some of the structure on the other side because it's picking up the ridges, the light, right, and shining through, kind of highlighting it. So it's especially when you have things like this, like a jello knight or any object, you can kind of think of it as a transparent object and kind of draw through its structure. Right, so I'm thinking about the helmet, this ridge that the light might pick up on that, and same for the armor on the belly, right? So I'm basically just drawing in that sphere here, right? So I'm kind of making that a little bit more subtle, but it gives it more of that transparent effect. Add jello texture. The jello brush. I mean, I'd pay to see Jello Knights fight. I mean, I don't know about you, but I'd pay good money for that. Why'd you have to kill my dreams, Gabriel? God damn it. What drives them? Oh boy. Let's say that's nearly impossible. I mean, jello comes close because it has that diffusion effect when it has high texture. Um, well, it still has just high specularity. It has no reflectivity because it has higher texture, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's diffusing a lot. Dirty water. Yeah, maybe it's dirty water. Maybe. Still, it's a tough question. Good question, but it's true. It is true. At least I would watch that. Studio jelly. Okay, let's do a bit of the red jello jelly night. It's very hard looking at super saturated red for a long time. Has anyone ever noticed that? Apparently, from a psychology point of view, or this has been tested, um, like if you have like a super saturated like red paint in your living room, or like a painting or something very big that has a large amount of saturated red, people tend to fight more and be more aggressive in that room. I mean, this jelly guy is just super aggressive. He's off the chart. But why is he killing the green dude? Yeah, that's true. That's true. How are we on time? Ooh, only an hour has passed. That's good. Let's make this like a 90-minute classroom. You're telling me, man. Now again here I gotta be careful because although he's in an action pose, he's actually molded this way, so I need to find attachment points. No. We're not cheating. We're not cheating squad, bro. He didn't. Most of my characters never skip like they do. Yeah, exactly. It's all genetic. Like, I have the weakest calves. I hate it, but I cannot change it. Yep. Nor do they. There's nothing wrong with flipping your Kansas. Really? Yeah, no. I work very fast and for clients, and my proportions just need to be accurate, and I don't have the time to fix things, so I'm constantly assessing. Yep. No, we do not. Because that just costs me money. Alright, so ambient light is going to affect my shadow side. We have a local color that's warm reddish, so we're going to cool that off a little bit. Desaturate it greatly. And then add that to the shadow side. Get a little bit more saturation. Have you backed your work since the... Oh. Fancy. Nope. Like that. Who doesn't back up for 1 week? How the fuck do you do that? Yep. Pretty sure that was what he was thinking. might see a purple. I feel like they should allow that. I definitely want to see that. Well, I'm not following. Of the green or the red? Oh, right. The shoulder. Wait. The right shoulder. This shoulder? It's pink on the edges. Oh yeah. You mean this? You mean this thing, right? Oh, okay. Yeah, because it's so it's the pauldron, but it's molded to the body, so it has that crisp edge, that corner. So I'm giving it that highlight, right? It's gonna just put this, but then it's just gonna have a little bit of that specularity as well on the surface itself, but it's not gonna be as specular as the corner. So that's why I give it that highlight in the crease. It's basically a crease. No, just lasso it and then invert that lasso and use the soft brush for the highlight. So lasso it like this, and then I shaded this and then inverted the selection, right? And then just used a highlight there to give it that crisp, sharp edge. Oh. It's all about that crispness, yo. And now I'm gonna use my super secret brush, so anyone that left, ha! No, I have this sticks brush, kind of my texture brush for everything. And I just add some of that. I break up some of that crispness. To give it more of that jello effect. Because jello is filled with light bubbles, so what you can also do on like the pauldrons, for instance, here, is you can show, because on the edges of any mold there's going to be the least amount of finish, so there can be some bubbles in there. to that a little bit, like that. For that fidelity, yo. We definitely should. Okay, so that visage of the helmet is still going to be molded, so we probably need like a transition here. It's going to catch a bit of that, and it's probably going to be just a little bit darker. Like that. No, where do we have sharp turns? We have one here. So the main thing that you should always remember is when it comes to specular. So what I don't like is too many fragmented specular highlights. The reason that is it doesn't look as natural is just the way that you also treat a ball. There's only one real highlight on a round object, any object really. Well, there's several, but there's always one strongest. So there's always one that's going to be closest to the light source. It's going to be the highest, where a lot of people fall into the trap of making the same intensity of highlight on, like, here on the head, but then they'll also do it like here, and it kind of really overblows everything. So you kind of need to be aware of that. Because you're in chat now. I appreciate it. You have. So we're probably gonna catch just a bit of rim light here and here. How's yours coming along, Alex? Nice. Yeah, so true. Yeah. Um, Not sure. I can do it. Like, if you can give me suggestions, Rob, on when that would be cool, and I can write something up. Yes. Right. Um, it's a good question. The main reason I zoom in is because I find the real estate of an iPad way too small not to. Um, if I were be no, it's only 13 inch or 12.9. So it's way too small. So like this zoom in is like the equivalent what I would have on a Cintiq, right? So I would be much less zooming in on a Cintiq than on an iPad. Um, so in that regard, I am definitely not an advocate of too much zooming in. So it's more of do as I say, not as I do. um, just because the iPad is it's just it's too small not to. Um, but if you have an iPad, I mean, just feel free to zoom in. The thing is, like, it does really have to do with experience, which means like the only reason that people tell you to avoid zooming in is because you might lose track of the bigger picture. But if you have the bigger picture in mind, it's not really a problem. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So that's a glaring issue for a lot of beginners. Yeah, 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 exactly. I have to constantly see the bigger picture, of course. Um right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. I've heard good things about the newest ones compared to like the first versions were really crap, but I've heard that like these new ones now are actually pretty good. Yeah, Wacom, they've I don't even know why they really have their head up their ass. Like there's so much yeah, there's so much competition now and they don't even bother to compete. They still have too much of a monopoly um in the professional industry, I'd say. But as soon as that changes, I mean, no, no, it's not. It's not. No, it's not the same. Yeah, because in most animations, it's like Modo and like Cinema 4D or. Okay. They really freaking do. Yes. Same here. No, there isn't. Yeah, just even like I don't even care about the price at that one. Like Apple is overpriced. You overprice it. I don't care. I'll buy it. Well, my company will buy it. Yeah, but just give me a 16-inch. Yeah, and no graphical power. Yeah, I know. That's actually one of the reasons I went PC. For 3D. Of course, I still haven't received my PC, but that's another story. No, it's fucking crypto. Goddamn miners. Yeah, it's Rob. Rob's buying up everything. Sorry, yeah. I saw you did a podcast with Modern Day James. Yeah, me neither. Haven't watched it yet, but alrighty. Gosh, and blur that shit. Yeah, should. What gonna need? This is the most. Maximum effort. Alright, guys. I'm gonna leave it at that. It was 90 minutes of classroom. We should do it. Any last questions or? All right. You're welcome.